So on that note, hello everybody. This is Joe Maldonado and Shana Robinson. Welcome to our fantastic series of interviews with witches. We have Shana who is with us, and this is a great question. Shana and I were just talking about. Shana is known for so many different hats and so many different things that she does. Um, Mostly, I would say shamanism perhaps would
Right.
be the first. So the question is, shamanism and divination. I asked for that question, and Shana, can you just start off with that and tell me what you said about magic and divination and etc.
Well, it was interesting as Joe and I were beginning to talk. Um, it was one of those things I said, you'll never guess the first note on my little piece of paper to remind me to speak about is this idea of the shaman, the magician, the witch, and the mage. These are all designations for various practitioners who engage in magic. In other words, they're dealing with the world as it is and working to bring about change, mostly through the help of invisible assistants. And so we can talk about angels, we could talk about devas, we could talk about allies, depending on what hat you choose to wear as you engage in your magical practice. I think the most important thing to recognize, though, as we're talking about shamans, witches, magicians, and mages, is that these traditions are very much entwined. There are aspects of all of them that overlap, and it's, at some point, it it becomes just a matter of style. I'll put it that way, a matter of style of how you engage in your practice.
Mhm.
And the other little note I had here, which might be interesting for the witchy types, more witchy types, the and we all engage in these kinds of things. The idea of theurgy versus thaumaturgy.
Oh,
So these are
that I
two
don't know. Beat,
two
beat.
words
Oh
that
my
are
goodness.
applied to witches or magical practitioners.
Mhm.
Theurgy is really the use of very formalized um, ceremony, ritual,
Mhm.
in order to connect with the divine. The divine is the purpose of a lot of theurgy. So this is where you get your grimoires, you get your Key of Solomon, you get your really dusty tomes that you think about, with all the mystical stuff. And after you read them, you realize that most of the work there is about purification. Hours of bathing, hours of praying, going into your factory, smudging, smoking incense. But with very definite purposes and very formalized. The thaumaturgy is a much more practical thing, and this is where I feel comfortable thinking about myself. It's the kitchen witch. You need to
Mhm.
do something. You go into the kitchen, you pull out your cinnamon, you pull out your nutmeg, and you stir the pot, whatever it is, and it is much less formalized and it's more intuitive. In the theurgy, there's this idea that if you don't do it exactly correctly, you will not be able to summon the angel or whatever spirit you're working with.
Mhm.
In thaumaturgy, it seems like it's a much more relaxed relationship you have with your allies. So those are the two words that are often applied to witches, and shamans come in there and can fall in either of those categories, and these all get overlapped. It's overlapping
Right.
in many, many ways. But when you look at all of them, divination is a really important piece of the work that's done. Because what you're doing is you're getting information from sources that are not ordinary reality, typically. I'll put it that
Yes.
way.
Yes.
But there's a whole range of how you divine. Some are very passive ways, and some are very active ways. So, but the point is, you got to have a question because if you don't have a question that you're taking out there, um, it's often hard for you to get an answer.
So if I can ask you then, if we
Sure.
were to say, could you give a definition for divination? What would that be?
It would be accessing information through non ordinary means,
Mhm.
plain
And
and
isn't that what
simple.
a journey is too, though,
Well,
actually?
a
Not
journey is a
ordinary
divination.
reality. Hmm.
A journey is a divination. And it was interesting. The little story I had about that was, so I was going to take my first shamanic divination class, gosh, 20 some odd years ago.
Uh-huh.
So I'm walking in and I'm expecting to see cards, pendulums, um, what are they called? Rods, all of
Yeah,
this
yeah,
stuff.
yeah, yeah. Divining
And
rods.
we start talking about a journey. And I'm like, what? Where's the stuff? And that's when I got my education that the journey is a divinatory process. It's on the far end of the scale because it's the most active. It takes the most potent questions to the helping spirits. You know to whom you're speaking,
Mhm.
which makes that very different than some other kinds of divination, which can be omens, omen texts, um, a whole lot of different kinds and styles. So there's an
And if I could
incredible
just do
range.
one more time out, I'm
Sure,
sorry for those that may not know, could you explain what a journey is?
sure. A journey for the shaman is the voyage of one's awareness to the other worlds. So if I am going to take a shamanic journey, I would decide where I'm going, who I'm going to meet. I may go
Right.
to the upper world with my awareness. I may go into the middle world with my awareness. I may go to the lower world with my awareness. And this idea of upper, middle, lower is not one of hierarchy, but one of frequency. So it's an idea that we're just changing frequency to be able to tune into the awareness of who or what is at that frequency to gain information. Now, this is something that's different from a path working or a guided meditation. While there's still a change in consciousness as we work with these other modes,
Mhm.
they're very different processes because one tells you what you're going to see, one has very formalized kinds of signposts on the way.
Mhm.
The journey is not that. The journey is a very spontaneous kind of interaction with the spirit world as you change frequencies.
So if I can
So,
ask you something,
oh, sure, please.
I just, and people that know me know that I work with my hands and they're energetic and they do stuff. So stopping at this time right now, which is 111,
Oh,
111. So,
yeah.
can we go into divination on just those numbers alone?
I think that's an interesting question.
It was not on our list of questions for sure.
No, it wasn't. And so, pop question, pop question.
Pop question.
Um, okay, so I think that there are a couple of things that work here. When we look at numbers, we begin to look at systems of divination. So there are certain systems of divination in which numbers have specific meaning. And so gematria is one of them that comes from Kabbalah, and we look at numbers, and numbers have significance. So at 111, it adds up to three. So what does three mean? If you're looking at the tree of life, you're talking about Binah. So you're talking about the Divine Mother. So, I mean, that's one way you can begin to take a message from something like that because you're using a system. Or you could say, okay, this number seems to be appearing to me frequently. I'm going to take a shamanic journey. I'm going to ask my helping spirits, why am I seeing this number? What am I to take from this? If you look at this, that's another demonstration of divination and the differences in things because if you look at a system, you are locked into meanings. If you look at a
Yes.
journey, the field of meaning is wide open. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to get the same answer.
Right.
But I go and take a journey and they're going to tell me, well, they're telling you, this divine mother is active in your life and you need to balance or something else. But I'll get more information from a journey perhaps than I might get from a system.
Right. Right.
Does that
And
make sense?
yeah, yeah, it does to me. And anybody that's on here, you can either write a question or a comment over in the chat window below there, or we can also, we're going to do after Shane is finished, do a little live, Q&A if everybody wants to pop in and just say, hey. But I just wanted to bring up in our description of this particular event today, a diviner is a person who through non-ordinary means accesses information through the help of the spirits. So that was already in there. And I just thank Shana so much for going into that a little bit more. And my grimoires, my journals, all these, my pendulums, all these things that live with me happily ever after. They're my tools. And I think, as people are exploring different things, like we will be exploring more things in your class on next Tuesday at 7 p.m. About, divination and how to and what, and, what it means then and how you can, and all those little miscellaneous things being answered. I think people just have a tendency, they'll be kind of pulled towards one or the other or another means of divining, so to speak, and then
Right.
you will find your own way.
Absolutely.
My pendulum, I don't carry it with me. I don't walk around with it. I know a lot of people do, but for me, my pendulum comes out when I just cannot go, out there into an objective perspective. And my connection is, I know people use power animals and angels and guardians, and etc. I've always had this connection with Mary. So, that's Mary.
Absolutely.
Mary is like Mary, my pendulum. My question is, like you said, you have to have a question, and
Right.
then off I go. And, I think because I don't abuse it and I trust it, it's always right for me anyway. Um,
Right.
so was it this first class that you went to that you learned to be a diviner? Is that when like the world opened up and gave you a big aha at that point? Or have you been dabbling in the divining arts before that?
That's really a difficult question to answer, because when does one say one is a diviner? When does one say when one actually became a witch or a shamanic practitioner? When do you, I think a lot of it is when you decide you're going to embrace it.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so you may be doing it a long time and you just come to the point where you decide you're going to embrace it. Um, so it's it's fascinating because always I can remember learning about a pendulum, and I've learned some interesting things since then too about a pendulum because I think they can be very accurate when you are somewhat dispassionate and can really separate yourself from the pendulum and you let it do its work.
Mm-hmm.
But I had a teacher tell me once that if you're not careful and you have a very strong feeling about the answer you want, you can actually get your pendulum to agree with you. So,
Yes, yes, I do believe that.
well, and for anybody who's done remote viewing, you can have, she said, she called it an AOL. You can AOL, analytical overlay with your pendulum. So that's kind of a cautionary word about the pendulum. However, it sounds like, Joe, you have a beautiful working relationship with a helping spirit who's helping you with the pendulum, and
Yes,
which
but
is
on that, on what you just said, it just brings to mind. I know when, our group, Gryphons Claw, the League of the Extraordinarily Gifted, is a group of individuals that all have these extrasensory, gifted, tools and skills that they deal with. And I know when we've been looking for a lost person or a lost animal, that this mental, you know transference of what I'm thinking, it's telepathy. It gets transmuted
right.
over or transferred over to like two or three other people, and then they transfer that to three or four other people. And before you know it, there's like 30 people with the wrong information
Right,
because
it's psychic telephone.
yes, it is. It's exactly what. Oh, yeah, I saw him in a park. Yeah, I did too. Was he fishing? Yeah, he was fishing.
Right,
And
right.
so I think divination, and like you said too, I mean, it, I have thought of that many times about I should, how do I do that? How do I become more objective, with using you know stones or crystals or rocks, or my pendulum or whatever else.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you know, how do you do it? That's easier. How do you do it?
I think that the biggest challenge is to practice, have feedback,
Mhm.
and to know yourself. Because in a shamanic practitioner's understanding, and I'll put it that way, the shaman is a hollow bone, which means that you're necessary in the process to bring information through, but you are not meant to have a vested interest in the information. So if I'm bringing information through for someone else about a relationship,
Mhm.
I cannot have any, it's like I don't want to have any skin in that game,
Yeah.
because if I have skin in that game, that may color my interpretation.
Mhm.
A lot of it is paying attention, and that's part of the coursework that we're going to do, because this is where the crux of the matter is. Because when we take a question, it is the literal question that gets answered, which means you have to write it down, exact language, exactly what you want to know, because the spirits and helpers are very literal. They're going to
Yes.
tell you exactly what you ask for. The problem with that is if you don't write it down and don't have an exact question, and you get perhaps a vision, or you count something, or there's another inroad to information, you begin to look at that, and oftentimes you're answering a question that is not the question you've asked. Okay,
Mhm.
so there's a beautiful example of this, and I'll share this right now because it's a great story. So, rock reading. You can read a rock. You
Mhm.
can take a rock, you can take a question to a rock, see images in a rock, and the rock can help you answer the question. So a young man says, how can I make my relationship with my girlfriend work? Okay? He takes the question to the rock. He sees the image of a pine tree in the rock, but the branches look like they're dying. And so he's looking at that, and his answer to the question is, I'm going to lose the relationship. Now, he didn't answer the question. The question isn't what happens to the relationship. The question is, how can I make the relationship work? So he's gotten a beautiful answer from the rock. He applies it to an entirely different question, and he's not getting an answer.
Right.
So when he is called on that and says, okay, now wait a minute. You've just told me through this pine tree the relationship isn't going to work. What was your question? How can I make my relationship work? Answer the question. Ah, something in me has to die. That's what he gets from the dead pine tree. Something in me has to die. So it's an entirely different response
Mhm.
to the literal question. So you have to answer the question you ask.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And also, I think, I always tell like my students when they're studying this kind of stuff to really pay attention to what their symbols are, to keep notes, to keep journals,
Right.
So if what does a pine tree mean to you? Like people will say, oh, a blackbird flew in front of me. What does that mean? So I never say what it means. I say, you look it up, and
Hmm.
what meaning you get out of that, that is your meaning. I'm not going to say when a blackbird flies in front of you, it means, a crow is chasing him from behind, and then there's an eagle behind the two of that. It's like, I'm not going to do that. So I do feel that it is an accumulation of the tools of your collection, of things that you've acquired, but I don't have a good memory, so I have to write them down. So
Yeah.
I know if I see a pine tree that's dying, to me, what that means to me is that I'm going to be planting more trees. Because whenever our pine trees are dying here on our property, it's because we've had storms, hurricanes, and they've fallen over and the needles are down. But for every tree that has been knocked down, I've replaced it with smaller trees, but I've replaced that on our property.
Right.
So for me, that has a totally different meaning than raising
Absolutely.
a
And
plant,
so
right?
you have just demonstrated completely, clearly, and beautifully that the spirits teach us and speak to us in the language of our personal vocabulary.
Yes.
And so the dead pine tree on the rock that the young man was looking at,
Mhm.
his meaning that he took from that was something in me has to die. You would see that and see an entirely different meaning in that.
Yep, I would.
Yeah,
I'd
which
be
is
digging
interesting.
dirt. That's what I would be
Which,
doing.
which is interesting because there were books of divination. When you look back to people like Aristotle, You look back to Cicero, when they were writing about these things, a lot of this got codified in Agrippa's book, Three Books of Occult Philosophy, which is fascinating because he has a whole list of what he calls auguries. And when people, and we'll talk a little bit about this in the class, we can go into some more depth about what the difference is between an omen text, sortilege, an augury, spontaneous divination. We can talk about those, but for the ancient ones and for the people working up through the Middle Ages, medieval times, they understood that there were auspices and auguries. An augury had to do with the movement of birds. So
Mm,
it was highly codified. So that if you, for example, left your house for some reason and a bird passes in front of you on the left, it had a particular name. That was called a fernova. That was a fernova augury. And that actually meant that it was a good sign over your work for the day.
wow. Okay.
So, and then an auspice. Now, that was using four-legged animals to get answers. So, my understanding of it is that many times the four-leggeds, how they walked, would be giving a message. And I would think it may have actually gone into another form of that because many times the four-leggeds are sacrificed as
Yeah.
part of a process. And this is old school. I mean, we're talking way back before we had different understandings about animals and sacrifice. And of course, the livers were read, organs were read
Yeah.
to get information. You know, the liver reads well. That means, you know, we'll win the battle or that kind of thing.
Yes. Yes.
So, I mean, this is all humankind working to get this information and understanding. Because the basis of this, when you're looking at the flight of birds, when you're looking to get some information, the whole idea is that we are all connected.
Yeah.
We are all connected in this soup of divinity, spirit, whatever.
Mhm.
And so, because of certain laws, laws of association, laws of, uh, it just flipped out of me. These connect us so that if I'm wanting to know about how my fishing is going to go for the day,
Mhm.
I am going to do some kind of divination with a fish bone, jawbone. This is what the Naskapi people do of Labrador, because the fish bone is connected to fish, which means I can read from the bone the fish.
Mhm. We have a question here. It says, "Hi,
Yes, sir.
Shana. Could it be that when we see a symbol or omen, that we personalize it and apply it to our individual circumstances?"
Interesting question. I think one of the first pieces of that is when you see something, for it to be of significance, to consider it an omen or a sign somehow, it should be something out of the ordinary that catches your attention. Because if every day you're living in an area where you see geese moving about,
Mhm.
it's going to be a different movement of the geese that's going to catch your attention.
Mhm.
So when you see the different movement of the geese, then you might apply it to your personal situation.
Right. Right.
However, it should be, and I'm not going to forget the word should.
Mhm.
We don't do shoulds, have to, or oughts. No, no, no. However, the best application of that is that if you have something that is engaging you as a question, something that's kind of permeating your existence at the moment, like you've had this ongoing battle with your mother, you're going to see her tomorrow, you
Yep.
know, this kind of thing, and you see this different movement of the geese, then the question is,
Yes.
what does this movement of geese tell me about this pervading situation?
Yes. Yes.
That would be my understanding of applying it. Because, again, to have a divination, there needs to be some kind of question,
Mhm.
typically,
Mhm.
to be the answer. Because
Right.
this is an answer coming to you, some information coming to you.
And I know with a pendulum, for example, that can get a little bit more tricky because a pendulum is typically a yes or no question. So then you have to think of, how am I going to ask this? And I know that I don't know pendulum work that much. I just know what I know and what
Mhm.
works for me. But I know that I think there's not only is there a certain way of asking the question, but there's also certain things that you should not ask or
Right.
preferably not ask. So
Right. Or you're not going to get good answers for certain
right.
questions.
So is that stuff that you would be covering on our next Tuesday night class or?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I can answer a piece of that now because there's a great difference between what we would call divination and prophecy.
Hmm. Oh boy, yeah.
So,
There's so
and
many components to this field of magic, isn't there?
oh my gosh, an incredible amount.
Yeah.
Now, and that's not to say that there aren't prophetic in situations where you do get some forewarning. I mean,
Yeah.
the prophetic dream is probably the most classic
Hmm.
piece of this. Um, but when we are doing divination in the magical sense of the shaman and in the magical sense of the witch, typically,
Hmm.
we don't ask a when question because the help we're getting is coming from non ordinary reality.
Right.
And non ordinary reality does not recognize time or space in the ways that we recognize it.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, if you talk about a psychologist looking at divination, you can think about, the Rorschach tests and all of these things.
Hmm.
What you're doing is you're opening up doors of perception,
Hmm.
just like you would do with that,
Hmm.
only you're evoking, summoning to you, or maybe even invoking, calling into you,
Yeah.
helping spirits that can provide you with information
Hmm.
to interpret.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
It all makes sense. I don't care about anybody else. No, I'm kidding. I'm sure it makes sense to pretty much everybody because I think it was very well explained. And I'm looking at our time. I know we're running out of time. Um, I am truly looking forward to this class, and it's done on a different day. We typically do classes on Saturdays and Sunday, but Shayna also has runs her own school and her own you know I want to say lectoral palette there because she is not just shamanism. There's so many different components of what it is that you teach. So, on that note, I will just say, everybody that is on this call, I warmly invite you to please join us next Tuesday, in which we will go into great detail. I know I am looking forward to it because one thing I don't want to do is I don't want to get the spirits mad at me because I didn't follow the rules. I know that's silly, but there are rules, and I think the
Well,
more I understand them, what they are, and I understand what I'm doing, the more sincere of heart I can be. And how could anybody be mad at me, right, Shana? I mean, there's like,
they can't.
I,
And really, in some ways, you can't do it wrong. What you can do though is mislead yourself.
yes, yes,
And so that's probably of all the things that we do shamanically, I think divination is probably one of the ones where a certain amount of discipline
yes,
is very helpful. And I'll
yes,
just put it that protocols and discipline, because it's hard for us to be honest with ourselves when we want that
yes.
card or that something to tell us something that we want to hear,
Yeah, yeah.
as
I will.
opposed
I
to
will get a buyer today, and I'm going to move out by 5 p.m. Oh,
right, yeah.
not happening. On that note, though, it is a little bit past our half-hour mark. I'm going to stop recording and to invite everybody to on mic and on video yourself, so we can all do a live one. Thank you for those that are watching the recording. You can follow all our recordings on our YouTube channel, and you will get a copy of the link to rewatch this again should you like to do that. Shana, my heart, thank you so very much.
Thank you.